Purposely. Your life, God's purpose. Listen at purposely.com.
I've got a lot of lingering people pleaser in me. I want to do the things that people want or expect for me to do, but my no's are super important because my no's preserve the long-term integrity of my leadership.
We are back for part 2 of my conversation with Sophie Hudson, known to a lot of us as Boo Mama. And I would encourage you, if you haven't listened to episode 1 yet, go back and take a listen to that. Fantastic conversation. And Sophie was incredibly gracious with her time, let me hang on to her for quite a bit longer. So we split that conversation into 2 parts. So part 1 is the episode right before this one. This is now episode 2, so you can pick right back up with us. And welcome my guest, Sophie Hudson. I love that you chose Moses because his life in particular is just littered with leadership. I mean, it's everywhere. From the Hebrew midwives who basically saved his life by saying, "Oh, these Hebrew girls, they give birth
so
too
hardy.
fast.
They're just
they're just hardy. They're hardy." To
Yeah.
Jochebed making a decision to both secret him and then release him in a way that was so unique. Pharaoh's daughter, who leads out by saying, "I'm going to take this kid," to his sister Miriam, to his wife. I mean, there are so many women around him who lead, and they don't always lead perfectly. Miriam's got issues. There are issues with some of this. But tell me what you began to discover as you looked both at his life and the women around him.
So I had really been stuck on this idea of writing about Moses, but I didn't know what. And I was really stuck on one little passage, and I was like, that's not a whole book. I don't know. So I thought, I'm going to read the book of Exodus. I was flying to Houston. I'm going to read the book of Exodus.
I
am
see what
so
pops
grateful
out,
for my relationship
strategy
with men who are not my husband. My
without
husband is so grateful for my
sign
relationship.
just get a whole row
with men who are not my husband. I'm so grateful for his relationships with women
and-
who aren't
and
his
here's
wife.
what I
But I
noticed,
trust
and
the
I mean,
health
it
of those
happened
relationships.
within
Maybe
2
that's the
chapters.
bottom line is
All those
it's
women
so
you mentioned,
subjective.
what they have
But
in
we
common
have made
is
it
the word
so
see.
weird. Every single one of those women, at some point, the Hebrew midwives, Jochebed and Miriam and Pharaoh's daughter, they all see. Jochebed sees that Moses is a fine baby. Miriam sees Moses in the Nile and then sees Pharaoh's daughter see him. Then goes to Pharaoh's daughter to broker this deal where Moses can be raised by his mom. Pharaoh's daughter sees Moses in the Nile, and they use their sight, all of these women, for the good of the group. They use their sight to come up with a strategy to preserve the life of this Hebrew child, and to raise him, because he's raised by his mother. He's raised in the Hebrew faith and then turned over to Pharaoh's daughter when he grows up. Now, what's interesting is that the first thing Moses does, according to scripture, after he grows up, he goes out and he sees a Hebrew fighting with an Egyptian and he kills the Egyptian. He doesn't use his sight redemptively. And so really that middle part of Moses's life where he's in Midian and he's exiled himself because he doesn't, he's heard Pharaoh is after him, is that he's figuring out what it looks like to see for the good of the group. And so when God finally appears to him in the burning bush, it's only when Moses turns aside to see that God calls him. So all these women, and Moses' life really impacted by women who saw on the very front part of his life, when he was an infant, and then even in Midian, when he marries Zipporah, and Zipporah handles some things that Moses would not, but all these women had incredible influence on his life. And I'm not saying that they're the reason that Moses knew to see, but certainly their sight impacted his life. And the very last thing we hear of Moses after his death is that his sight was unhindered. So this notion of seeing was a huge part of his life and his leadership.
I find it so unique that as Moses is leading, as he's taking the people on the Exodus from Egypt to the Promised Land, we can sometimes skip past this a little bit, that he was part of a leadership team. It was Moses, it was Aaron, and it was Miriam. And I don't know why that gets lost on the spreadsheet sometimes for
Yeah.
us. So
Yeah.
unpack a little bit some of the leadership responsibilities that you find that Miriam had in this huge undertaking of
Yeah.
moving this large group of people with
Yeah.
all kinds of opinions and family issues and on and on and on. What were the ways in which her leadership spoke to that group, helped that group, guided that group?
The thing about Miriam, and I think we hear about her sort of in passing. I actually had a line in the book, and I think I took it out, that she's a little bit of she's like the first, I don't know, mega church worship leader in a way,
Yeah. I see that.
But even like the Song of Moses that comes after they cross the Red Sea, it's attributed to Moses, and then there's one little section that's attributed to Miriam. There are a lot of scholars who say that it's actually Miriam wrote what is the Song of Moses. And she led the group in worship. And what I take away from that all the time is it's a both and, right? Like the Israelites needed Moses and they needed Aaron, because Moses didn't want to say anything. He didn't want to use his voice. But they needed Moses and they needed Miriam. It wasn't that Miriam wanted to take over. It wasn't that Miriam was after Moses' job. It wasn't that Miriam was jealous of Moses and launched a campaign to undermine him. It was a both and, is that both of those leaders were necessary and critical to the deliverance of the Israelites. And what a loss it would have been to have not had both of them. I mean, Miriam was a prophet. And so it's interesting, though, that even the narrative of Exodus, I'm not saying it minimizes her, but I am saying that we don't have the same sort of chronicle, maybe, when it comes to everything that she did versus everything that Moses did. But we very much know that they were a team, and we know that she wasn't afraid to tell them the truth. I don't know. I think that so often the arguments we hear now about women in leadership are, you go over here and the men will go over here and we'll just do our own independent things. I think the picture that I have after spending some time in the book of Exodus is that we work together for the good of everybody. That was sort of a rambly answer, but it's a complex piece of the dynamics in the book of Exodus, I think.
One thing that I think we have responded with in a lot of our modern faith communities is we often really septate. Okay, the women's ministry is over here.
Yes.
And the guys' ministry is over here. And we'll do something maybe for the married folk, and maybe we'll have a singles mixer.
Yeah.
But it feels like you're in very containerized affinity groups to some degree.
You're in silos. Yeah.
You're in silos. Mm-hmm. And what happens in that is that you may have women in leadership within the silo of women's leadership or within women's ministry. And you may have guys who are in leadership within the silo of the guys' ministry.
Right.
But it's not as common to find that blend happening in a way in which everybody's learning from each other, they're linking arms. I think part of it comes because we've wanted to do the best we can to not, mix things up at times in a way that could be challenging or might challenge, say, a marriage that's struggling or some of those kinds of things. I understand why, and I understand the thoughts behind some of the buffers put in place.
Right.
However, it does rob us of each other's wisdom, because I got to tell you, Sophie, on the other hand, where we sometimes feel like maybe women can be minimized or their leadership can be minimized, I've also seen women who've kind of gotten fed up and now they don't want to hear anything a guy has to say, or if it's anything driven from a male perspective, they don't want anything to do with that because of the frustration of what they've experienced through the years. So in that debate, that's where I see things kind of come to a freeze. It's just like, we're not really moving forward. We're not moving back. We're just kind of holding right here. What do you see?
Listen, I'm going to be super candid about this. And I'm not speaking for Julie, everybody. I'm just telling you, I think we're so weird about this in the church. I think we are so weird about it. my former boss, I adored him. He's like my favorite person I've ever worked for. We hadn't worked together in almost 4 years. We continue to have a debate about the Billy Graham rule. This notion that like a man can't be in a car with a woman who's not his wife. Here's what I think we've done. And I'm like you. I understand why some of those things are put in place. And listen, if a person is struggling in a particular way, absolutely, let's help them any way that we can. I just don't think everybody is struggling that particular way, right?
Right.
I've always had guy friends. I have always looked to my guy friends for insight and feedback, and I love their perspective. But somehow we have come to this impasse where it's like we feel like we can't be integrated together as men and women unless we're married, or unless there are, like you say, some really clear parameters around all that communication. Everybody's got to know their weakness. Everybody's got to know what is potentially a stumbling block for them. But I think we forget that we're brothers and sisters. We're brothers and sisters. And when we have brothers and sisters, we tend to those relationships, and I want relationships with my brothers. I want relationships with my sisters, but I am frustrated by this tendency that always puts me with my sisters. I'm supposed to go with my sisters. So there's a lot of nuance to that. There's a lot of discussion that has to go around that for it to feel healthy, for a variety of people. But I do think our neglect of the brother-sister dynamic in a community of faith, and I mean that like that as a woman, I have brothers in the faith. As a man, my husband has sisters in the faith. I'm interested in a conversation where we talk about better ways to facilitate that.
Thank you to our sponsor, George Fox University. George Fox University is unique. It is a Christ-centered, student-focused university where your student is going to be appreciated for the individual they are, the learning style, and the goals that they have, while also keeping focus on their relationship with Christ. I want you to go check it out at georgefox.edu. Again, that's georgefox.edu. Thanks so much for being our sponsor, George Fox. Love that you bring up the family relationship, which is replete throughout the New Testament, talking about the way we're to view each other. I know you're going to be shocked, Sophie. Just get ready. I'm the oldest and only daughter. I know. Stunning.
Sure.
I have two younger brothers, and my brothers have been my best friends my whole life. And I've always worked in male-dominated cultures when I was in radio and television, and then in my work today as a consultant, as a writer. I've always worked with men a lot.
Yeah.
And what's funny about it is I think sometimes the things that we think will be preventative, it just means people hide things more.
Oh, 100%.
I don't know that it's really all that preventative. And on the flip side, it then does make it odd in ways it doesn't need to be awkward or odd with those people you work with when you work in different faith spaces too, because I'm like you, I have guys that they are my brothers in Christ. We work well together. It's not weird. It's fantastic. And it's unfortunate that sometimes we bring the weird to it when the 100%. Weird didn't have to be there.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I'm thinking about a couple of friends of mine who are guys. Now, here's what I would say. And maybe this is my personal litmus test. I love the way my guy friends talk about their wives, the way they honor them with their words, with their actions. I love to watch the dynamic between the two of them. Now, if I had a friendship with a guy and his relationship with his wife or his significant other, if that was off in some way, maybe, I would be more mindful of boundaries or whatever. But I think when we're in healthy places in our heads and our hearts, those relationships are only going to enrich our lives. They're going to be a plus, and they're not going to subtract from the closest relationships in our lives. So I'm like you, I am so grateful for my relationships with men who are not my husband. My husband is so grateful for my relationships with men who are not my husband. I'm so grateful for his relationships with women who aren't his wife. But I trust the health of those relationships. Maybe that's the bottom line, is it's so subjective, but we have made it so weird. When you're somebody like I worked real closely with my friend Brian. We had kind of similar, just his role at work and my role at work, just we work together all the time. And I remember telling Sean, our boss, like, Brian and I need to go research a park down the way for a retreat, but I know we can't get in the car together, which is just strange.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It is a very interesting dynamic. And because I toggle back and forth so much in my work between the faith space and the secular space,
Yeah,
it's pretty fascinating sometimes when you feel like in the secular space, people might have a little bit healthier perspective sometimes on how to interact. And I think, wow, this is one of the places that I think impacts women in leadership in faith spaces, because of course, to your point, we don't want to make somebody stumble. We don't want to cause a problem. But in sort of, just dosing everybody, we then make it weird. I don't know. It's just a very interesting question.
It is. I know. And it's one of my favorite things to talk about, just to hear different people's perspectives on it. Cause I know, maybe my perspective is of course based in my own personal history, knowing my own strengths and my own weaknesses. That's, not my experience is not everybody's experience. So.
Right. Well, tell me what a woman can do as she's thinking, okay, now that I'm understanding a little bit more of a unique perspective on leadership, now that I'm understanding that it's not just about who has the power or who has the microphone, how do we go about determining those places that we are uniquely gifted and we are uniquely called to step out in leadership? I mean, I feel like the first thing that we all need to understand is we're leading somewhere. We all are somewhere a leader somewhere, and it can be for good or for ill, but we're leading somewhere. But once I understand that precept, then what comes after that? As I'm pursuing Christ, as I'm engaged in my faith community, how do I figure out what leadership looks like for me at that point?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things. I think one, as women, a lot of times we know when we're younger what we really love. And we kind of know what lights us up I know that's subjective too, but we know what lights us up from the inside out when we get to do it, But in the process of taking care of a lot of other people's needs in the middle stretch of our lives, sometimes it's hard to stay in touch with that, because you are just doing the stuff that needs to get done. Your own personal fulfillment in your leadership is not necessarily at the top of the list. Now, if you have maintained a really active career in that stage of your life, it may be a little bit easier. But I would say if you're just mystified by, I don't even remember what I like to do. I would say look back at your childhood, look back at your teenage years when you had the freedom to kind of run after whatever it was that you love to be a part of. So I think that's a good place to start. I think as we get older, we also start to have some pretty good insight into where we're gifted. Now, we're reluctant sometimes to say, hey, I'm gifted in this area. But by the time you're 40, are you the one that people always come to when they need to sort something out, when they need to confide in somebody? Are you the one that when something needs to be organized that everybody always goes to first and says, hey, would you head this up? Are you the person on a Sunday morning when somebody didn't show up to teach that people can call on and say, hey, we got a little bit of an emergency here. Could you fill in here? Like when you look at the places where you have sort of automatically been summoned over the course of your life, I think that's a good place to look, because a lot of times our natural giftings we take really for granted. And particularly, I think our friends who are administrative think that everybody operates that way. I'm going to tell you, you just need to take one look at me to know that not everybody operates that way. So I think that's a good place to go. And then I think the other place you can go is you can go to trusted friends and you can say, hey, I'm not asking you this because I need you to build me up. I'm asking you this because I'm trying to suss it out in my own life. Like, what are some places where you think maybe I have some natural ability? What are some places where maybe you see me lead and I don't even know that I'm leading? That's vulnerable to do that, but I think it's really worthwhile to do that. That's actually, I would say, how I think I finally made my peace with the fact that I am endlessly fascinated by leadership. Was a friend of mine pointed it out to me. She said, "You realize you have a bottomless interest in leadership." And I'd never thought about it. And I was like, "Oh, I do. You're right." So I think the input of trusted friends is super valuable in that process.
Absolutely. Because we have a fractured understanding of leadership, here's another area I would love to hear you speak to. I myself experienced when I was in church leadership that there was an expectation on the part of a lot of people that because I was a quote unquote leader, that things needed to be placed on me like, well, she'll handle that. She's the leader. There is that segment of our faith communities, I think. We have those who way over volunteer and there's way too much on them. And we're the ones who've made church more complex because now we've got to have, Barnum and Bailey 3-ring circus when it comes to Sunday mornings. And it takes a lot of people to try to run it on a nonprofit kind of budget. But there is also something of an attitude sometimes that if someone is identified in the way we typically identify leadership, fractured as that may be, that now they're going to have to be responsible for all the stuff. Yeah. And I have to say that coming out of some of that stuff, Sophie, my husband and I every now and then will look at each other and go, we're just going to go to church and sit on a back row. And
Absolutely.
We don't want anybody to tap us for leadership, which That's also means we have a fractured understanding of leadership.
Right.
How do we find the strength appropriately to lead out in the ways we're supposed to lead out without getting to that place, which Moses came to, and Jethro had to sit him down and talk to him about it, where you feel like, oh, being a leader means that you're responsible for everything. Yeah. And if you don't have enough volunteers, and if you don't have a successful event, and if you don't have X, Y, Z, then somehow you failed as a leader and you've got to take on even more the next time to try to push something across the line. How do we heal from that?
That's a thing, by the way. That's a thing. I talk in the book about boundaries, which I know is a term that gets overused. And I think part of the responsibility, though, of leadership is you have to ruthlessly self-inventory. And you have to ruthlessly assess where you are in terms of margin. And nothing will frustrate people more than when you say no. No, I can't. Like that is not mine to do. I heard this past weekend, I was at a conference and there was a lot of talk about what is mine to do. That is not mine to do. And I think it helps if you're married. It helps when you have a partner who can kind of stand behind you and kind of, gird you up a little bit and say, you're exactly right. No. I think having a clear understanding of our own capacity as leaders is helpful. I am not a high capacity person. I would say I'm a low capacity leader. I'm going to need about twice as much time to recharge after, I participate in something. And I'm going to need to be alone. And so I have to be mindful of the fact that my no's are just as important as my yeses. My no's may even be more important than my yeses because my inclination is always to yes. I've got a lot of lingering people pleaser in me. I want to do the things that people want or expect for me to do, but my no's are super important because my no's preserve the long-term integrity of my leadership. And so the no's prevent me from overextending myself, from just stretching my heart to the point that it's not functioning like it should. The no's prevent me from making an idol out of my service or my leadership, to think that I'm such an integral part of this organization that it can't possibly function without me, which is such a lie. So I think we have to be people who are willing to say no. And I think we have to understand that that no doesn't make us bad people. That no doesn't mean that we're not willing. That no means that we have a boundary that we need to protect. And because we want to continue to be able to say yes to the stuff that we're best at and the stuff that matters most in our particular ministry of leadership, deliverance, whatever you want to call it, we got to be able to say no. And we got to be able to say, I can help you 2 Sundays a month, no more. And not feel like it's our responsibility then to, now, if it's your job, it's a whole different, more complex deal.
Right,
but if you're talking about from a volunteer perspective, I think you've got to go into it pretty boundaried. And listen, sometimes the church is not great at respecting our boundaries, not because it's malicious, but like you said, because there are a lot of spinning plates and they're trying to find people to spin them.
Right. Absolutely. You said something that really sparked something in me. You know, I have confused often the leadership positions that you will be placed in if you are people pleasing. It's pretty amazing, the relationship between how, you can work yourself, quote unquote, into a leadership position. But if the fuel you're burning to do it is people pleasing, that actually doesn't end up being leadership at all. Positionally, it may look like it.
It's an idol.
Functionally, it will not. Functionally, you will be chasing your own tail. How can we do that inventory to understand where our motivation is coming from to make sure that we're doing a better job, maybe not going, I'm people pleasing my way into a position of influence versus this is what I was designed for. This is where God really has placed me.
I think you have to ask yourself really hard questions. And oh my goodness, I will tell you, there was, it was only after I left my job at school that I probably really honestly answered this one. But I think the first thing we have to say is this thing an idol for me? Is belonging here an idol for me? Is being accepted here an idol for me? Is being in a position of some influence here, is that an idol for me? That's a hard question to ask, because we are hardwired to want to belong in spaces. But there is a difference between belonging because this is my community of believers and belonging because I have set this thing on an altar. And that's a hard distinction to make. We have to probably check that out with the wisdom of other people. So, and then I think, is this responsibility, is this feeding something in me? Is there a neediness in me here? Or is this really because I am delighted to contribute to the good of the group? I think if we can kind of frame those things in the context, is this for other people or is this for me? If it's for us, I think we have to check it. I think we have to kind of dig into, okay, well, what would that be? What am I getting out of this? A lot of times, though, I think our enthusiasm for the group will pull us in, and then it shifts. And then it's about, what do we know as a result of being welcomed into this space? Do we feel like we've been the chosen because we've been welcomed into this space? And I think whenever it starts feeding that side of us, we gotta be honest, and we gotta take a pause for a minute. We need to work through that. It's hard to do, especially in these church cultures where a lot of times our leaders are so charismatic across areas, and where you feel like somebody has unhooked the like golden rope to allow you in.
Yeah.
I'm just not sure that's what it's supposed to look like.
Love that. Well, Sophie Hudson, you are amazing. I know that your new book, I think we could just keep talking and talking. And I want to tell the listener, hey, there is so much more to consider here. And Sophie's book, Find Sight to See, Leading Because You Were Made for It, is going to be a great resource for you to go to consider what you're doing, why you're doing it, where you are leading, where you might not even realize, and where you might be doing it for other reasons, even though positionally it might look like leadership. So, Sophie, where can the listener go to find out more about the book, find your podcast, all the stuff?
So my blog is still there, even though I don't blog anymore. It's bmama.net. It has all the podcast episodes there. And then social media wise, I am primarily on Instagram, and it's bmama205. I was not present on the day when they said that all your social media accounts need to match.
Had to all match.
Yeah. So, but I am on Instagram. And so that's kind of my home base as far as social media goes. And there's a lot of information about the book there, and always link new podcast episodes there and that kind of stuff.
Perfect. Well, Sophie, can't thank you enough for taking the time to be with me today, for letting me keep you a little bit longer. And again, man, I would just love to keep talking. So thanks so much for being on today.
Thanks, Julie. I loved it.
All right, listener, you know what to do. Go to those show notes where Rebecca will have all the links for you and the places where you can find all the goodness that is Sophie. And be sure you check out AllMomDoes, AllMomDoes.com, AllMomDoes on the socials. And I love to hang out with you too on the socials, mainly over on Instagram, Julie Lyles Carr over there. Would you do me a huge favor when you subscribe to the podcast? When you grab this link and you send it to a friend, that does amazing things. It helps get the word out, and we appreciate it so much when you do that. And we will see you next time on the AllMomDoes podcast.